Welcome, everyone. We will start now.
Thank you very much, Karin. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to the first webinar arranged by the Interdisciplinary Academy at SLU that's led by the SLU Future Foods. And this is a kind of kickoff for the Interdisciplinary Academy. My name is Marie Stenseke. I'm the director of the Academy, and this is my first day at work as a director. The aim of the initiative is to increase knowledge and interest, as you might have read on the slides you saw, in interdisciplinarity among SLU researchers, and also to build up their capacity, as well as SLU's capacity in addressing and engaging with complex problems like the contemporary global challenges that we face, that certainly demands collaboration between various strands of science. So this is a very timely and well-needed kind of initiative taken by SLU to strengthen interdisciplinary work. The Interdisciplinary Academy will, it kind of, a base of it is to offer opportunities for interdisciplinary teams to jointly work with the complex problem during 8 months for 20% of the time. And we had an application or a call this spring that resulted in 5 interesting applications, and 2 teams were selected, and they will now start their work 1st of November. But the Interdisciplinary Academy will also address and hold these kind of open seminars on interdisciplinarity to stimulate discussions also outside those teams, and then hopefully in the long run get more and in a number of new interesting applications for the next round of calls that will come next year. That is what we plan. I'm Marie Stenseke. I have my background as a professor in human geography at the University of Gothenburg. And I've been working extensively with the, you could say in the interface between natural science and social science in research and in various strategic bodies on local, national, European and international level for a number of years. And I'm very happy and eager to contribute in developing interdisciplinary research at SLU, but as I see it also, that would contribute to taking steps forward for interdisciplinary work, not just at SLU, but also in the broader sense in Sweden and outside. Today, we're happy to have as our first speaker in the Interdisciplinary Academy's webinars, Håkan Jönsson, who's a guest professor at SLU in Alnarp, and also ethnologist at Lund University. So please, Håkan, I'll leave the word to you. Please introduce yourself more as appropriate, and then give us your reflections on interdisciplinary research from your perspective. Please, Håkan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Marie, for this kind introduction, and it's really an honor to be the first speaker at the Interdisciplinary Academy. And if you're not already aware of it, I mean, you will soon be that there are many great thinkers and researchers who have been thinking a lot about interdisciplinary research. There is even interdisciplinary research on interdisciplinary research, and a lot of discussions about the appropriate definitions of what is interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, and so forth. But I'll leave that for the upcoming seminars, and my presentation today will be on a more, say, personal level, dealing with my own experiences of participating in different interdisciplinary contexts. And I have 2 topics to discuss, actually. The first is why do we need interdisciplinary research? And after dealing with that for some time, I will move on then to the other and equally important question then, if we if we know a reason for why we should do interdisciplinary research, do we also know how to do it? And some reflections on different ways to do it. But I start with the why question. And for me, and I should make that clear from the start, that I have been involved primarily research with food already from the starting point of my academic career, and actually also before that, because I had a background in working with food service. But I think and hope that even though my examples are very much deriving from the food context, that they should also be applicable, even if you think that you are not primarily dealing with food as a substance, but with other topics and research field related to the University of Agriculture. I mean, there are different ways to deal with that, and again, this is a food examples, and one can start to have this argument about why should you engage in interdisciplinary projects on food? Why should you try to convince the grant office at the Research Council of Horizon Europe, etc., that you must devote a pile of money to more interdisciplinary research on food and not just traditional disciplinary research? And then I myself and a lot of us, we come always up with these arguments. Food is interdisciplinary as such, and the food-related challenges demands it. The health and sustainability challenges, they demand it. And I think that's correct, and I will get back to that in just a minute or so. But I think that we must also start by challenging the whole assumption on what a research discipline is. Who decides actually what a research discipline is and what is not? And in order to discuss that, I think we have to move back to the very beginning, to the birth of research, higher research and education as we know it. Because the research disciplines, they are not born out of nothing. They are not God-given. They are invented by people, invented in different cultural contexts. And if we talk about food and why universities are so badly equipped on dealing with food and the food-related challenges, I think this is the guy to blame. Plato, the Greek philosopher, the founder of the first academia. And I am quite convinced that if Plato have had another view on food and not least the preparation of food, that is cooking, I think that universities would have looked very much different. Plato was a philosopher in the tradition where you had a clear privilege of mind over body. And everything that was sort of obscured the pure thinking, the domain of the ideas, that was something that was challenging, it was disturbing, and the philosopher should just, try to ignore that totally. And in the dialogue Gorgias, he claims that all sort of these sort of distractions, such as cooking, is a form of flattery, mischievous, deceitful, mean, and ignoble activity. And the argument is that it cheats us with shapes and colors, smoothing and draping. It sort of, obscures the purity of ideas. But what if Plato had actually acknowledged that maybe there's something good to cooking? Maybe it's not just that they provide us with some essential nutrients. Maybe that's an important part of life. The shapes and the colors, right? The sensory attributes, that we have a body that is actually important and that we need to take care of. Not just sort of ignore to reach a higher state of mental mind. But anyway, food was not a topic as such in Plato's academia. And just until very recently, I think that food has had a very low status in higher research and education. For different reasons. There is a legacy of Plato to consider it to be too trivial and also too physical. I mean, it deals too much with the body to be attractive to researchers. It's also trivial, and I mean, we should acknowledge that in most research disciplines, if not all, there is a tendency to deal with the spectacular, the extraordinary, things that happen, things that happens on rare occasion rather than the trivial activities of everyday life. Just go through the discipline of history, how much history there is about the history of war, and how much there is of the history of the long periods of peace, right? Take geology, a lot of research on volcanic eruptions and less on the solid rocks. And of course, there can be good reasons for dealing with the spectacular and the extraordinary. But still, I think that if we are to deal with life of humans and other species on the planet, we could actually focus a lot more on the everyday trivialities, because that is actually the thing that we do for most of our lives, all of us, no matter where we are. Another reason for the ignorance of food is, of course, that food and in particular cooking has been considered as a feminine sphere, something for women that and it's not something that male professors should deal with in the context of academia. Also, of course, related to the classical divide between the public and the private. I mean, the public sphere, that is where the universities are a part of, and it's a sort of a protected, gated community for wealthy male professors, right? But all of this has sort of been challenged now, and I think a sign of the new time is that interdisciplinary food studies, which I have the privilege to be a visiting professor at SLU in, is one of the fastest growing academic fields. But the challenge is now, I think, to redefine the study topics as well as the reward systems within academia. And I'm not sure how a food university would look like if you start with the food and the food related challenges, but I'm absolutely 100% convinced that it will look nothing at all like the universities we have today. There would be faculty of law, faculty of social science, humanities, natural scientists, technical faculties, economics, and so forth, because it's a completely irrelevant way of dividing research when it comes to food. Just have a look at this one of hundreds of illustrations of the food system. What if we think out of the university box and think about a food system university? And you can just look at, I mean, on the self-reliance, health, economy, community resilience, environmental stewardship, livelihood. I mean, not only the traditional value chain that you have in the middle, where you go from pre-production to farming to processing, logistics, retail and consumption, but also everything that is involved in between. And for instance, where do you put culture in this? There is a sort of a tendency that I, as a cultural researcher, I become involved when it's about consumption. And I'm expected to explain why are consumers so irrational and don't consume more healthy, more sustainable, and so forth. But culture is involved at all steps. There is a specific culture among researchers. I mean, Plato was situated in a specific culture dealing with the neglect of food, sensorics, cooking, and so forth. Farmers have a specific occupational culture that, of course, is different between different geographical areas and different time. But culture is involved in all parts of the food system. So is, of course, law. There are so many regulations involved in all parts of the food system. So there is a need to deal with the specific parts. And I think that having the food system as a sort of an alternative lens instead of university and faculties is sort of fruitful, because it allows focus without losing the big picture. At least it's something to connect the greater whole to. And another reason for the why of the interdisciplinary and food system approach is to deal with its challenges. I mean, it's no use to be innovative in only a single part of the traditional food value chain if other parts of the food system can't deliver, right? It will not change the food system to become more sustainable, to promote more healthy habits and a higher degree of resilience and so forth. And there are definitely a lot of good attempts towards dealing with food-related challenges that fails due to a lack of understanding between the different parts. So one way of talking about interdisciplinary research is talking about intermediation, and that goes also way beyond research. I mean, we need the intermediators that can try to create a fruitful dialogue and cross-fertilization, not only between research disciplines, but also between the different parts in the food system. I think that the intermediating dimensions of interdisciplinary research is of the utmost importance, and maybe it's the intermediation that is more important than the specific outcomes of a specific interdisciplinary research project. The intermediation and the mutual understanding, knowledge transition, taking new perspectives into account, they are super interesting, and that's also why you need to be all a little bit careful about evaluating, for instance, the Interdisciplinary Research Academy, right? It is not the impact of a specific interdisciplinary research project that you can measure and say, this is a failure or this is a success. The impact will be visible after a generation, where the researchers and everyone that they have collaborated with have impact in the various small details, a lot of other projects and so forth. And I think that we can actually now see some of the fruits deriving from the first generation of interdisciplinary research from, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And finally, of course, the transparency and trust issue is also an important thing that is also impossible to offer if you do not have the interaction, the dialogue, and the possibility to translate knowledge and concepts between different parts of the food system. So that's sort of the my very personal answers to the why of interdisciplinary research and a focus on food. And then the second question, and that's a really tricky one, then how to do it. Even if we agree that yes, maybe this interdisciplinary thing sounds reasonable, how should we do it? And I will give you 4 different examples that I've been part of that I think all have something to tell in a short narrative. The first one is a project where I was not part of the actual research, but I was part of an external research expert committee where we came from different research disciplines, and we were supposed to evaluate this project. And that is also one of the reasons for why I just stated this, that, I mean, don't think so much about the outcome of a specific research project, because I think that this research project may not have had exceptional results as such, but it definitely had a lot of impact in the long run, because it created a new research community, and not least it shook all of the participants with providing the new perspective. The idea was quite simple. It was to counteract the age-related loss of skeletal muscle mass, and it dealt with questions of medicine, of proteins and the proteins as a part of a healthy diet, and also involved social and cultural perspective on aging, exercise, and diet. And I think that important starting point, that is always the applied starting point, that the counteracting, everyone needed to have that in mind, because that was the first letter in the acronym CALM, counteracting. There was also a willingness to share and use similar data, and they also did a lot of, say, experiments, I mean, interventions, which should be studied from a number of perspectives. And I think that the contributions from the historians and cultural researchers here were quite important also for the understanding from people coming from the disciplines of medicine and food technology. Also to see how aging and diet policies are developed from historical processes that may not really exist in people's mind. I mean, when you talked about people, talked about how they experienced how to eat the product, how to use them, they were, I mean, the consumers may move way faster than the institutions that they are part of. So there is also this sort of a, to look at on the institutions that you are part of as part of an historical and cultural process. What they did was quite interesting, I think. They forced the participants to share and define their angles of the topic. And the topic as such was that they collected stories of protein, with a focus on whey protein, because that was the industrial involvement in the project to use whey proteins in new ways to improve the diet for elderly people. And you can see that there are a lot of entrances towards proteins and whey proteins. Some saw it as the powder, some saw proteins as something, as food, where there are certain foodstuffs that are rich in proteins. Others thought about it in terms of amino acids, as you can see to the bottom left. Some thought about it in the historical context and how we have dealt with diet and exercise and the feeding via protein and whey in an institutional context. And some were thinking about how proteins or the lack of specific proteins affected the muscles. And all of this, they said, okay, let's write an article, whey protein stories, sort of an experiment where they collected, they say, write down, I think it was 1 or maximum 2 pages for each of the participants. Write down your version of what is protein, what is whey protein, and then they had a joint discussion. I think that can be maybe a topic for another and upcoming seminar, that article. The second part is where I actually first met and interacted with a lot of people from SLU, also I think leading in the end for why I was invited as a visiting professor. That was the Food Researchers Network. It was started in 1999, and it has and it remained until I think 2016 or something like that, and then there were so many other seminar series and so forth. So all of us thought that okay, let's leave it to other parties. But we had there was always an ambition to have 2 food researchers in the same seminar, and they should come from different disciplines. And I think that encouraged very different discussions compared to monodisciplinary seminars. It was, I remember as a young PhD student, it was terrible because all of a sudden you thought you had something that was so interesting from a, internal disciplinary perspective, a very much related to the hottest cultural theory of the year. And you just get the question, okay, but so what? I don't get it. You could get this sort of question, and so you force yourself to answer. Okay, what will be the answer for the usefulness of my research? And I certainly remember that even myself, I thought that the first years we were very often talking, just above the head of the others. But gradually, sort of a new way to talk about research and dealing with it was created some sort of research community that has been important for this generation of food researchers in southern Sweden. We were not many at that time. We are not that many still, but I think quite a lot of people dealing with food research, at least close to the consumption parts of food, they met within these research seminar. And it also evoked some multidisciplinary collaborations. And I just, this is what it could look like. We always started with coffee. That was the important thing, always before the seminar started. And everyone was there. Everyone was there at 9:30, even earlier than that. When I was a coordinator, it was terrible because I said 9:30 start, and I started, bringing out the coffee and stuff. But I realized I had to be there at least at 9 o'clock because everyone was popping in. And this is one example where I invited first Stefan Röstner, as most of you probably know, and he was, and it was also this sort of relaxed way. I mean, he quite openly talked about 35 years of chronic failure in solving obesity. And then it came on Mikkelsen talking about the new Nordic diet, and he was also interesting because he was sort of deconstructing the entire ambitions of the new Nordic diet, and he said that this was the first time he was actually ever allowed to talk about his research, because in Denmark it became a huge conflict, and he was he had to face quite severe criticism from Klaus Meyer and the other ones. But here everyone met, have a fruitful dialogue, very, very harsh and open at some times, but always very respectful. And then also a sort of a joint discussion here. In this time, is it possible to change food habits? That was sort of what tied these two very different. I mean, one professor in medicine and one PhD student, or recently become PhD in sociology, from two different contexts. It created a dialogue about all again this sort of applied dimension. Is it possible to change food habits, and is so why, and what can we learn from different perspectives? And I think that at these seminars, I met the Professor Lena Ekelund in horticultural economics, and we started to think about this of the perceptions of quality and how that had changed in time. I was dealing with milk, she was dealing with horticulture, and when we started to talk about tomatoes and why does tomatoes taste as they do, equals nothing, especially at the time. And we started to trace all of the historical context and background of this, and realized that there were a lot of intertwinement here of plant breeding, but also how plant breeding was affected by policies and culture. It's difficult to measure taste, so taste was sort of move away from the story. Fascinating insights in the protocols from the Joint Committee of Fruit and Vegetables in the European Union, where not least the image I shown here, where what happens when food companies started to challenge the qualification scheme of tomatoes by not only mixing tomatoes with different sizes, which was a whole threat to the whole idea of premium first grade tomatoes, but also of different colors. And that was sort of threatened the whole idea of, the modern way of quality, that everything should look standardized. They should be, perfectly round. They should all look the same and taste the same. That was premium quality. While as this was a new concept designed for consumers that thought that, well, this really looks nice. This is premium quality. So we sort of started to unwrap a economical, historical, cultural, and also horticultural process by starting with the tomatoes. And you can also read that, of course. Finally, my last example here is the recently closed Next Food project that was led by the SLU here and the Department of People and Society, where a huge Horizon Europe project about building the education for the next generation of professionals in the agri-food sector. And we got the rather tough task to define the needed skills for the future, and also where are the gaps between current research and education and what should be needed in the future. And in order to try to do that, I mean, there was a quite problematic actually to compare, especially education in different research. In different countries, sorry. Research is more easy to compare actually, because sort of a joint common language, but education is still very much mostly presented in the native language, and there are a lot of things that is difficult to see from the outside. And here we did a mix of methodologies. You can see at the top where I am in Greece doing a focus group with advisors in a farm school outside Thessaloniki. And that gave, of course, some very interesting input to how the advisors and also students and farmers, the different sorts of focus group, how they defined the role of education, the skills that was needed, and the skills that they were equipped with after doing or not doing education. I definitely remember a farmer that sort of looked at me as I was coming from another planet when I asked what type of education that he thought would be important for the next generation in his farm. And he just looked at me and said, farming is learned in the field, not in the classroom. So it was sort of out of the context. But they had a lot of other fascinating technologies for knowledge development, which I will not go into now. But what you look at the bottom was that we thought that, okay, we need to complement these very interesting qualitative insights with some sort of quantitative approach. So I met a person at the food technology department who was specialized in informatics, bioinformatics. He had done, studies clustering of impacts of diet. But here I was, how can you quantify this? And yeah. He said there are methods for web scraping. I didn't know what web scraping was, but basically you can just, you code and then you select all the words used in the curricula and the marketing and communication material for all master programs in food and education, food and agriculture education in Europe. And then we can sort of try the hypotheses. Were there really a connection between networking, for instance, or sustainable mindset and so forth? And that gave us some food for thought and also possible comparable dimensions. So this is a publication in the making. Hopefully it will be published soon, but it remains to be seen. It's not too easy to publish interdisciplinary research, but it was indeed an interesting way to see. And it was also sort of relieving to see that even though we had completely different background, we had completely different methodologies, when it came to the result, there was absolutely no problem of, critically discuss them. since it was the relevance of something that we both knew and were dealing with in different ways, that is education and research in Europe for a more sustainable future food system. Okay, so I will wrap up this talk now with some reflections on recommendations on interdisciplinary research. The first thing is that you must spend some time on a clear aim, and that the aim should be calling not for don't think too much about interdisciplinary research, but think about if there is an aim that calls for competences from different research traditions. Is that needed? Yes, move then on to try to make some interdisciplinary research funding. But you really need to know that the aim really calls for competences from different research traditions, because otherwise you will have problem afterwards. Define a problem and potential solutions early on in the process and make them clear and transparent for all, and discuss them. If there are diverging views, deal with them. What is also, I think, extremely important is that whenever possible, share and use the same research material. I mean, take the interventions in the CAR project. I mean, to be able to study intervention from different angles, how it was perceived, the background and the context of the participant, as well as the muscle mass, as well as the sensory properties of the food that the participants in the intervention were given. But share the same research material so that you are actually talking about more or less the same thing. And because then you will be able to meet and see that, okay, you can interpret this material from very different angles. Also, the daily interaction, or at least regular interactions, the coffee break chat, or the coffee before the interdisciplinary research, that will sort of make you talk and think and create a mutual trust. And don't be afraid of conflicts or the diverging views. They are a key to knowledge development, and don't be afraid to visualize them. Bring them out in the public, discuss them, because that is at least as fruitful as the common views here. And I think also that the end user perspective is always a good starting point, because everyone can sort of agree on that. I mean, speaking about how we can create more sustainable food habits and so forth, or better diet for elderly people suffering from malnutrition. If we keep that in mind, it's easy to see that we are working towards the same goal, and that there is an end user that will hopefully be affected by the research we are doing together. And not least the mutual respect and open mind. I've been in so many seminars where people from different research traditions, they come to try to convince the other one that their research methodology is better than the other. But this is not really science, and they'll say, oh, that's so shallow. And so, I mean, we wouldn't have been and stayed in the university if there hadn't been something in the research tradition that we have been working with. And of course, there are no one single method that is science and that provides always the best research. It depends on the question. And if we have had all the answers in the first place, we would be in an interdisciplinary context, right? So, I mean, skip all of that. There will be diverging views later on, but they should be based on the outcomes and the aim that we share together, and not a sort of a fixed starting point that is actually, to be honest, maybe more ideology than research. And that will sort of conclude my answer with this view also. Try to avoid the idea of excellence in academia. because the idea of excellence is way too often defined as being the main expert on a tiny small topic, because that is one way to be the expert or the research group being expert on this. And there are, and hopefully a few attempts on becoming excellent in impact or in dealing with important topics. As for now, the reward system and academia is still very much about research excellence that is defined by being the expert in a small topic. But let's try to challenge that, avoid to go into that, because more knowledge on the pieces, on the small pieces of the puzzle is only relevant if it creates a clearer view and can build the puzzle together. So start to struggle for and create new ways of formulating and making excellent interdisciplinary research. Thank you very much. And that concludes my presentation, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Håkan. This was really great, and you really convinced us that food is a perfect lens to talk about interdisciplinarity. And thanks for your sharing your experiences and the insights in this. Yeah, I especially noted that we might not evaluate the Interdisciplinary Academy until in 20 to 40 years, so that's a bit comforting. Depending how it goes. But anyway, we have 2 questions in the chat, and I would call out